began on a damp autumn evening in the village of Saint-Antoine-le-Haut, nestled deep in the Loire Valley, where vines curled over crumbling stone walls and the air forever carried the sweet scent of decaying leaves and wine barrels. The fog was especially thick that night, so thick that the outline of the old Dufresne manor, already shadowed by ivy and years of neglect, seemed more like a dream half remembered than something real. And yet inside there was nothing dreamy about what had just occurred. The scream had come at precisely 7:14 p.m., according to the chiming of the great-grandfather clock in the salon, which, despite its stately air, had been threatening to give out for nearly a decade. The scream had come from Madame Dufresne herself, or at least that's what the 6 women present in the house that evening claimed. By the time the housekeeper Léonie reached the drawing-room, the lady of the house was sprawled lifeless on the Aubusson rug, one hand frozen mid-reach toward the lace-covered tea-table, her face contorted in something between terror and disbelief. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no strange footprints in the dew-damp garden, and most damningly, no one had left or entered the house. The front gate was bolted, the doors secured. Everyone who had been inside remained, and all had alibis, or claimed to. The 6 women were not strangers. They had all been invited by Madame Dufresne for what had become a curious village tradition, the widow's tea, an annual gathering for women of a certain age, a certain history, and, unspoken but understood, a certain burden. Each of them had lost a husband, all under varying circumstances, and all under the soft scrutiny of a village that noticed everything but understood little. There was Madame Marchand, once the talk of the opera stage, now frail but forever draped in silk scarves and theatrical glances. Beside her sat the tall and sharply intelligent Madame Fournier, who had once taught mathematics at the lycée and who now claimed to find God in gardening. The reclusive Madame Deschamps, tight-lipped and trembling, rarely spoke at all unless spoken to. Madame Leclerc, the innkeeper's widow, brought the air of hospitality and a whiff of liquor to every room. Madame Bellamy, still radiant despite her age, had outlived 3 husbands and was always the first to offer a theory, a suspicion, or a joke. And finally, there was Madame Renard, young by comparison, barely past 50, her widowhood only a year old, and already she had become known for her habit of standing too close, watching too long. Each one of them swore by the same story. They had been taking tea with Madame Dufresne, chatting amiably about nothing of consequence, the price of wool, a new vicar, the upcoming autumn fête, when their hostess suddenly gasped, staggered to her feet, and collapsed. No cry of pain, no visible wound, no sign of poison in the tea, all of which had been poured from the same pot. And yet Madame Dufresne was unmistakably dead. Dr. Legrand, summoned by bicycle within the hour, found no marks on the body. Her heart had simply stopped, he said with a shrug of his thick shoulders, and at her age, 72, it was entirely plausible. But it did not sit right with Inspector Delacour, who arrived from Blois the next morning with polished boots, polished manners, and a particular distaste for anything too tidy. He paced the drawing-room for hours, speaking little, touching nothing. He noted the polished silver, the half-eaten madeleines, the heavy velvet curtains drawn back against the fog, and the curious absence of a certain detail. Madame Dufresne's rosary, which she wore without fail every day of her life, was gone. None of the women had seen it, or so they said. Léonie, in her small, hoarse voice, insisted she had laid it on the dressing-table that morning, as she always did. She liked to hold it when she prayed before tea, the housekeeper added, said it calmed her nerves. The rosary, a simple thing, wooden beads with a tiny silver crucifix, might have seemed unremarkable except for one curious fact. It had belonged to her husband, a priest defrocked under scandalous circumstances decades ago, who had later drowned in the river under equally murky terms. Some in the village said it had been suicide. Others whispered darker things, but it wasn't until 3 days later, during the reading of Madame Dufresne's will, that the case twisted from peculiar to impossible. Each of the 6 widows had been left a letter, handwritten by the deceased and dated only 2 weeks prior. Each letter contained the same line, though its phrasing was slightly adjusted for tone. By the time you read this, the truth will have been set in motion. You were always clever, my dear, but clever enough to remember what we did? No one spoke as the notary read the letters aloud. The women stared at each other with pale, tight expressions. Madame Fournier blinked furiously behind her spectacles. Madame Bellamy laughed once, sharply, then stopped herself. Madame Renard was the first to speak. "It's a joke. She was fond of riddles." But the room didn't believe her. Not entirely. That very evening Miss Marple arrived by quiet train from London, having received a letter of her own, a delicate, unsigned invitation from a French cousin she scarcely remembered, but which had been enough to pique her interest. That and the enclosed clipping from Le Petit Courrier, describing the sudden and suspicious death of one Madame Céleste Dufresne, along with the phrase handwritten in ink that had clearly come from a woman's hand, "There are secrets among the 6. I fear I have made a grave mistake." Miss Marple, her knitting in one hand and her handbag in the other, stepped off the platform with the air of a woman who had seen such cases before, though never with 6 suspects so refined, so interwoven, and so utterly silent about whatever haunted their past. The mystery, it seemed, was not in how Madame Dufresne had died. It was in what she had known, or what she had remembered. And somewhere in the fog-wrapped corridors of that vine-covered manor, in the quiet glances and unfinished sentences of 6 women who had each buried a husband, the answer waited. Elegant, buried, and dangerous. The morning after her arrival, Miss Marple stood at the window of her modest guest room in the village inn, a thin shawl draped over her shoulders, as she gazed out at the fog curling around Saint-Antoine-le-Haut like a cat settling over its favorite perch. The bell from the church tower tolled 8, and the cobbled streets remained still, save for a stray chicken and a boy carrying baguettes in a cloth sling. The countryside had always seemed more peaceful on the surface, she thought, but it was precisely in places like these, small, quiet, self-contained, that secrets settled deepest, like silt at the bottom of an old well. She had not told anyone the full truth about why she'd come, nor did she intend to. The letter had been unsigned, yes, but the handwriting, tilted to the right, restrained but nervous, had seemed hauntingly familiar. She remembered a young woman named Celeste, all bright eyes and sharp questions, from a holiday in Paris nearly 4 decades past. They had crossed paths only briefly, but Miss Marple never forgot a face, nor a tone that hinted at both fear and brilliance. Now Celeste was dead, and something about her death did not sit well with her. She arrived at Dufresne Manor just before 10, having made arrangements through the notary for a short meeting with Inspector Delacour. The inspector greeted her with polished civility and a skeptical eye. "Madame Marple, was it? From England?" he said, as they stepped into the drawing-room where the tea had been served 3 days earlier. "We've been quite thorough, I assure you. There is no evidence of foul play. Heart failure, it seems. Stress, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded politely, her blue eyes already scanning the room. "Yes, I read your report. Very thorough indeed. Though I wonder, has anyone located the missing rosary?" Delacourt's expression faltered ever so slightly. "It is a sentimental trinket, nothing of consequence." "Sometimes sentiment is precisely what people are willing to kill for," she said gently, and moved toward the fireplace. The room still bore traces of the gathering. Empty teacups lined neatly on a side table, crumbs of Madeleine on a saucer, the slight impression on the divan where someone had perched anxiously. The hearth had gone cold, but the ashes inside seemed oddly uneven. Miss Marple bent closer. Was this fire lit that evening? Yes, Delacour replied. The housekeeper said Madame Dufresne liked to have it burning even in autumn. She used the tip of her parasol to shift a small mound of ash. Beneath it, blackened but still distinct, was a scorched fragment of paper. She did not touch it, only observed the curled edge and what appeared to be the remains of writing, neat and cramped, written in violet ink. Not the ink of the letters the women had received, she noted. Those had been in blue. Delacour, noticing her focus, stepped forward with mild annoyance. We did not find that before. I'm sure you were looking for something larger, she said with a smile. Sometimes the smallest clues have the loudest voices. He did not answer. As they left the drawing room, she requested to speak with the housekeeper. Léonie, pale and pinched, was summoned from the kitchen. She had the worn look of someone who had served a household for so long that her bones had adapted to the manor's structure. Miss Marple asked her about the rosary, gently but firmly. It was on the dressing table when I brought up the tea tray, Léonie said, rubbing her hands in her apron. She always touched it before going down. But not this time? No, I didn't see her pick it up. Had anything else gone missing recently? Léonie hesitated. Number only. Well, the Bible, from the bedroom. The family Bible? No, her husband's, the one with the red leather cover. She always kept it under her pillow. I noticed it wasn't there the next morning. Miss Marple inclined her head. Strange, a rosary and a Bible, both meaningful, both religious. As she walked the corridor back toward the salon, her mind ticked steadily. What had Madame Dufresne been trying to burn? Why had she been reaching toward the tea table when she collapsed? Had she seen something or someone that startled her? And why would a woman whose faith had endured disgrace and death suddenly misplace her two most sacred possessions? Later that day, at the notary's office, Miss Marple was permitted to examine copies of the 6 letters. Each was similar in structure but subtly personalized. Madame Bellamy's letter included a sly reference to your skill in persuading Henri to take the boat that night. Madame Fournier's warned, your calculations were always too precise. Perhaps now you will see the flaw. Miss Marple copied these details carefully into a small notebook. She visited Madame Bellamy that afternoon under the pretense of neighborly concern. The widow received her with amused eyes and a velvet robe loosely tied. My dear, you are far from home, she said, offering a liqueur. Come to chase ghosts? I've found they do quite a lot of damage when ignored, Miss Marple replied. They spoke lightly at first, but Miss Marple gradually nudged the conversation towards the letters. Madame Bellamy laughed again, but this time it was brittle. Celeste always had a flair for dramatics, as if one afternoon tea could unravel the past. Could it? The smile dimmed. Only if someone wanted it to. Miss Marple observed her closely, how her fingers twisted the stem of the glass, how her gaze darted toward the window each time a car passed. A woman used to control, now slightly unmoored. Do you believe she died of natural causes? Miss Marple asked. She was old. People die, Madame Bellamy said, and drank quickly. That night, as the fog returned and the village lights dimmed, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. One detail nagged at her. Of all the women present, only one had sat closest to the tea table, Madame Deschamps, and yet she had said the least. The following morning, Miss Marple visited the gardener, a slow-moving man named Gérard, who had worked for the Dufresne for 30 years. She asked if he had seen anything unusual on the day of the tea. No, he said after a moment. only that the lady moved her favorite rose bush. Moved it? She insisted I transplant it to the corner of the garden, said it didn't belong near the window anymore. Miss Marple frowned. Which window? The drawing room, he said, where she always had her tea. As she returned to her lodgings, Miss Marple stopped at the manor once more and examined the spot. The soil was still soft where the bush had been uprooted. She knelt, brushing aside damp leaves and mud, until her hand struck something hard, a small wooden cross, not quite buried but half hidden, and beneath it something wrapped in oilcloth. She did not open it there. Not yet, but as she stood, heart calm, mind racing, she knew that Madame Dufresne had been afraid, not just of what the others might do, but of what she had remembered. She had buried more than regret beneath that rose bush. The pieces were beginning to stir, and someone, somewhere in Saint-Antoine-le-Haut, was watching very closely, wondering how much the quiet Englishwoman had seen. Miss Marple sat in her room that evening, with the oilcloth bundle laid carefully on the small writing desk. Her lamp turned low. With gentle hands she unwrapped the cloth, revealing a slender leather-bound volume with a worn red cover, Father Dufresne's Bible. Her fingertips lingered over the edge of it, noting the indentations on the binding, the frayed edges of a bookmark made from silk ribbon. When she opened the book, it resisted slightly, as though unused for some time. But near the back, a hollow had been cut through the pages, and nestled inside was a delicate object, the missing rosary. The crucifix was cold to the touch, its silver dulled by age. But beneath it, pressed flat into the carved pages, was something else, a folded scrap of paper, brittle and yellowed. She read it twice, silently. Then she placed the Bible back into the cloth, wrapped it tightly, and locked it away in her traveling case. The note would not solve the mystery alone, but it revealed something important. Someone had been trying, in her own careful way, to confess, or to warn. By morning, Miss Marple had arranged for private conversations with the 6 widows, one by one. The notary, intrigued and mildly scandalized, agreed to help. It was not official police business, but there was something about the way the Englishwoman asked, not forcefully, but with that unflinching gaze, that made even the most reticent of the village lean forward and speak. Madame Fournier came first. She arrived with her gloves still on and a faint smell of lavender soap clinging to her coat. She greeted Miss Marple with a cool politeness and sat straight-backed in the chair. She was frail, she said in a matter-of-fact tone. It doesn't surprise me that her heart gave out. Frankly, what surprises me is that it didn't happen sooner. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet, you wrote her often, did you not? I noticed her correspondence drawer, your letters tied together with ribbon. Fournier hesitated. We were schoolmates once, in Paris, before her marriage. Yes. Did she ever speak of her husband? She rarely did. We all knew the story, of course, the priesthood, the drowning. Celeste kept her ghosts wrapped up neatly, like handkerchiefs. She paused. We all do. And that day, Miss Marple pressed, did anything seem unusual? Fournier folded her hands. Only that she was watching us more closely than usual, as though weighing something. And the moment she collapsed, she reached for the sugar bowl. I think she was going to add a second lump. Not her rosary. No, Fournier said, frowning. At least, not that I noticed. When Madame Fournier left, Madame Leclerc arrived in her place, her face flushed from the walk. She brought a tin of biscuits and offered them apologetically. I don't like all this, she said as she sat. The questions, the talk. Celeste was good to me. I don't want to make her death into a story. It's not a story, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. It's simply the truth, however inconvenient. Madame Leclerc shifted. Well, I did notice something, I suppose. Just before Celeste stood up, she looked at Madame Deschamps. Not long, just a glance, but it was sharp, like she'd seen something she hadn't expected. And what did Madame Deschamps do? Nothing. She sat still, looking at her cup, not even surprised. And after? She said nothing, not a word. The contradiction was subtle, but it caught like a thread snagged on a splinter. When Fournier had spoken, she had described Madame Dufresne reaching for the sugar bowl. But Leclerc insisted it was a glance, not a gesture. It was impossible to say which was true, or if either was, but both women had been seated on the same side of the table and should have seen the same thing. Madame Deschamps arrived late, drawn and twitchy, her black coat clutched around her like armor. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was like dried leaves. "I don't remember anything. I have migraines. The noise, it unsettles me." Miss Marple let the silence grow long, allowing the woman to fill it. Eventually, Deschamps added, "She said something just before she collapsed. I don't know if the others heard." "What did she say?" "You shouldn't have." "That's all, just that." Then she gasped. "You're quite sure?" Deschamps nodded. "I think she was looking at Madame Bellamy when she said it." "Not you." A pause, a tiny, almost imperceptible flinch. Not me." She left quickly after that, nearly fleeing. Miss Marple jotted down a small note. The words had been spoken softly enough to escape most ears, but Deschamps had heard them. Why? Unless she had been listening especially closely, or unless they had been said to her. Madame Bellamy, in contrast, was cool and collected when she returned. "I see you're assembling your little case," she said with amusement. "Have you found the hidden dagger yet?" "There are always daggers," Miss Marple replied. "They simply don't look like weapons." Bellamy leaned back. "And what do I look like, Miss Marple? A vengeful widow? A blackmailer? You look like a woman who knows how to keep secrets, which is often more dangerous." Bellamy smiled slowly. "Let's not pretend, dear. We all had reasons to dislike her. She reminded us of what we had done or hadn't done. She judged us. She was frightened, I think. Frightened enough to dig up the past, to threaten us with it." Her smile faded. "She should have known better." "And what happened, Madame Bellamy?" "She stood up. She faltered. She died, that's all." But her eyes said something else. Her composure was too perfect, too rehearsed. Finally, there was Madame Renard, youngest of them all. She arrived quietly, with none of the tension or arrogance of the others. "She was kind to me," Renard said, "treated me like a daughter. And yet, she changed. After my husband died, she became watchful, like she wanted to ask me something but didn't know how." "Do you know what it was?" Renard shook her head. "Only that she once said, 'Your husband had secrets. They all do. Don't carry them for him.' I didn't know what she meant. And on the day of the tea, I think she realized something. There was this moment. She looked at me, really looked, and I think she finally understood what had happened the night of the boat fire." Miss Marple blinked. "Boat fire?" Renard paused. "It wasn't in the papers. Years ago, before I married, a small motorboat. 2 men drowned. The police said it was an accident." "And your husband?" "Was there, but he said he couldn't swim. Said he jumped." Miss Marple's breath caught. A boat, a drowning, a priest long dead, and now this. The pattern was no longer tangled, merely hidden. And each widow, each version of the truth, was a thread leading back to one terrible night long. Ago. When Renard left, Miss Marple sat in silence, her knitting untouched beside her. The contradictions were no longer about memory. They were signs of guilt, of alliances frayed. One woman had lied. Perhaps all of them had, in their own way. Madame Dufresne had remembered something. something enough to unearth her husband's Bible, bury the rosary, and burn a note. She had invited them, not for reconciliation, but revelation, and someone had seen that moment coming. Miss Marple stood, her mind quietly racing. There were still truths hidden beneath all that politeness and perfume. But now she knew where to press. The voices had begun to fracture, and the deception was no longer quite so charming. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the window of her room in the inn, the rain tapping softly against the glass as the wind moved through the narrow lanes of Saint-Antoine-le-Haut. The warmth of her tea had long faded, yet she held the cup absently, deep in thought. The 6 widows, each cloaked in years of politeness and practiced grief, had offered her fragments, versions of the truth, some polished, others brittle, none entirely trustworthy. But the real story, she sensed, lay not in their words, but in what lingered behind them, and in the spaces where their accounts failed to overlap. She took out her small notebook, flipping through the pages lined with tidy handwriting, names, dates, glances, inconsistencies, threads of a tapestry yet to be stitched. A pattern was forming, but it wasn't clear yet. Not quite. Madame Dufresne had called them all together. That wasn't kindness, it was strategy. And if the Bible, the rosary, and the scorched note were any indication, she had known something dangerous. The question was, had she intended to reveal it or simply remind them? The next morning, Miss Marple made her way once more to Dufresne Manor. The house had taken on a strange quiet in the days since the death. Less grief, more tension. Léonie let her in without a word, her eyes dark with worry. Miss Marple stopped her gently in the foyer. "You've served this house a long time, haven't you?" Léonie gave a small nod. "Then you might understand something that others do not," Miss Marple continued. "Madame Dufresne knew more than she let on, and I suspect, in her way, she tried to leave something behind. A trail." The housekeeper's lips pressed together. "She said, the night before the tea, 'Old ghosts are louder in autumn.' I thought it was just one of her little sayings." "She was trying to settle something unfinished," Miss Marple said. "I think she knew the end was near, but not in the way it came." Léonie hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. "There's something I never told the police. I didn't think it mattered, but maybe now." She led Miss Marple to the upstairs hallway, to a narrow cabinet tucked near the linen closet. From within, she produced a faded photo album, the kind with thick pages, and black and white snapshots mounted by little corner tabs. "She had me hide it years ago, told me to keep it away from the others." Miss Marple opened it carefully. Most of the images were expected: wedding portraits, picnics on the Loire, the dusty elegance of the old church where her husband had once served. But one photograph stood out: 6 women, far younger, seated at a long table aboard a boat. The Dufresne crest was visible on the hull behind them. She leaned in. There was Bellamy, still beautiful though sharper, Fournier with a thinner face and the same calculating eyes, and next to her, unmistakably, was a man. Not Father Dufresne, another, standing at the helm, smiling with a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Do you recognize him?" she asked. Léonie nodded slowly. "Henri Deschamps, Madame Deschamps' first husband, drowned, same year as the priest, in the same stretch of river." Miss Marple felt her heart skip slightly. 2 men, 1 river, 1 boat, and now 6 women, all connected to both. The next visit was to Inspector Delacour, who had begun to eye Miss Marple with a mix of frustration and awe. She laid the photo album gently on his desk. "I think we've been looking at the wrong end of the story," she told him. "This is not simply about Madame Dufresne's death. It's about something that happened 20 years ago, a boating accident that wasn't quite so accidental." Delacour frowned. "That old scandal? The priest and the fisherman? There was gossip, yes, but no proof of wrongdoing. No proof, Miss Marple agreed, because the only witnesses were the 6 women now gathered under one roof. He opened the album, narrowed his eyes. You think one of them killed Madame Dufresne to protect a secret? No, Miss Marple said softly. I think all of them had a hand in what happened then, and now they each believe one of the others is trying to expose it. Delacour sat back. A conspiracy? A shared silence. That's much harder to undo. Later that day, she called again on Madame Bellamy, unannounced. The widow was less amused this time, her manner tight. I see you've been busy, Miss Marple, stirring teacups and graves alike. Only the ones someone tried to forget. Miss Marple laid the photograph down on the parlor table. Bellamy didn't touch it, but her eyes locked on the man at the helm. He was charming, she said after a moment, and reckless. We all thought he was just a boy playing captain, but he was cruel in small ways. He liked to make us feel powerless, especially Celeste. She never mentioned him in her letters. Of course not. She blamed herself for everything. For what, exactly? Bellamy looked away. It was supposed to be an outing, but something happened. Someone went overboard. The priest jumped after him, but it was too late. Or maybe he didn't mean to save him at all. I don't know anymore. And after? We never spoke of it again. It was easier, safer. But it never left her, Miss Marple said gently. And now she tried, in her own quiet way, to bring it into the light. Bellamy's laugh was short and bitter. Light burns, we all had reasons to keep it buried. And they had. Miss Marple reviewed her notes once more, her mind assembling motives like cards in a hand. Madame Fournier, precise and cold, had she known of the affair between her husband and Madame Dufresne? Madame Deschamps, whose husband had drowned, was it revenge she carried, or guilt? Madame Leclerc, ever protective of her late husband's reputation, had she feared scandal might reach him, even from the grave? Madame Bellamy, the master manipulator, had she nudged events then, just as she tried to steer perception now? And Madame Renard, youngest, most easily dismissed, who had married into the story without knowing it, and who perhaps feared most of all what her husband had confessed before his own death. It was not one motive, it was all of them. Greed for peace, jealousy over lost affections, revenge buried under years of civility, fear that the truth would not just wound reputations, but destroy them. That night, as the church bell struck 10, Miss Marple returned to the Dufresne garden, where the rosebush had once stood. There, by the light of her lantern, she knelt again. Her fingers searched the soil carefully until they struck wood, another small cross deeper than the first, and beneath it, this time, wrapped in linen stained faintly by rust, she found what she expected, a locket. Inside was a photograph of Celeste, younger, her arm around a man whose face had been scratched out. Whoever had buried it had wanted to remember her, but not him. A memory preserved in part and erased in part, like the story itself. Miss Marple stood slowly, brushing the earth from her knees. It was no longer a question of who had wanted Celeste dead. The truth was more unsettling. All of them had something to fear, but only one had acted, and now the motives had formed a full circle. She just had to find the one thread that did not belong. The next morning broke with startling clarity. No fog, no rain, only the unrelenting stillness of a village that had held its breath too long. The sun cut sharp across the cobbles and lit the Dufresne manor in a way that made it look somehow smaller, stripped of its usual mystery. But mystery clung where it always did, not in walls or windows, but in people. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Delacour in his office, watching as he unwrapped the locket she'd found beneath the second cross. He regarded it with a sort of grim satisfaction, like a man beginning to believe the pieces had finally found their places. The locket was buried, he said, intentionally hidden, and the photograph inside, clearly of Madame Dufresne, with someone she once cared for deeply, a man she later erased. Why bury it? To bury what it meant, Miss Marple replied softly, or to prevent others from seeing it. Delacour tapped the scratched-out face. I had it examined. Based on other photographs from the priest's ordination, our expert confirms it's likely Father Dufresne himself, which means Madame Dufresne loved him, before or after the vows were broken. And she tried to forget him, Miss Marple murmured, or tried to protect him. Delacour sat back. Combined with the photograph from the boat and the old rumors, it paints a simple story. There was a scandal, perhaps even an affair between the priest and one of the women, a confrontation on the boat. Dufresne intervened. 2 men drowned. The women covered it up. Now one of them feared exposure and silenced Madame Dufresne. He paused, then added, "And now we may know which." He reached into his desk drawer and placed another item on the table, a silver teaspoon. The tip of the handle was slightly tarnished, but the rest gleamed. It was found in Madame Deschamps' handbag this morning. She was visiting the church, and a cleaner reported her leaving something strange behind. We recovered it. This, he tapped the spoon, matches the exact pattern of Madame Dufresne's tea set, engraved with the family crest. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. You think she took it during the tea? Delacour nodded. Or switched it with another. We sent it to the lab. Trace elements of digitalis on the surface. Poison. The word fell heavy between them. She poisoned the tea? Miss Marple asked, but there was only 1 pot. Everyone drank from it, Delacour smirked. Perhaps not everyone drank equally, or perhaps Madame Dufresne received a special cup. Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet. An hour later, Madame Deschamps sat in a chair at the gendarmerie, shaking, her hands clenched like brittle claws in her lap. She had not spoken since the arrest, not to the officers, not to the priest who had come to offer her comfort. But when Miss Marple entered, she looked up, eyes shining with something between terror and despair. I didn't kill her, she whispered. You had motive, Delacour said. Your husband died under suspicious circumstances. She knew something. She was going to speak. She already had, Deschamps said. To me, the night before. She came to my home, said she was tired, said she'd lied too long. Miss Marple leaned in, gently. What did she tell you? That Henri wasn't meant to die, Deschamps said, trembling. He was pushed, yes, but not by Celeste, by someone else. She said she tried to save him, tried to tell the truth afterward, but the others, they were afraid of what would follow. So you kept quiet all these years? Deschamps nodded, eyes wet. She wasn't threatening me. She was asking forgiveness. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Then why the spoon in your bag? I don't know, she said, voice cracking. I swear I don't. I never touched the tea. I never touched anything. Delacour looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple sat back slowly. Something wasn't right. She returned to the manor that afternoon, seeking Léonie again. The housekeeper answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and an air of wary fatigue. There's something I didn't mention, she said before Miss Marple could even speak. The day before the tea, I saw someone else in the house. Someone Madame Dufresne didn't know had come. Who? Madame Renard. Miss Marple blinked. Are you certain? She came early. I heard her arguing with Madame Dufresne, not loud but sharp, about something to do with her husband. That evening Miss Marple returned to the church, where she knew Renard had taken to walking alone at twilight. She found her there, standing in the nave, head bowed as though in prayer. Miss Marple stepped beside her quietly. He told you, didn't he? Your husband. before he died. Renard did not move. About the boat, about what really happened. Renard turned slowly. Her eyes were clear, almost peaceful. He said they laughed when it happened. Said it was a joke, that the priest was angry, but not enough to kill. Henri hit his head when he fell. It wasn't planned. But the priest jumped in after him, Miss Marple said, and he never came back up either. Renard nodded. He tried to save Henri, but they panicked. The women. My husband said they held the priest down. He was struggling. Bellamy screamed he'd ruin everything. And Madame Dufresne. She watched. He said she froze, didn't help, didn't scream, just watched, like she'd broken inside. Miss Marple closed her eyes a moment. And you confronted her? I asked her what I was supposed to do with that, Renard said, her voice trembling now. She told me to let it stay buried, said the truth wouldn't help anyone. And then she asked me to come to the tea, said it was time to tell the others, that she couldn't hold it alone anymore. Miss Marple met her gaze. But you didn't want the truth out, did you? Not because of your husband, but because of you. Because the story would circle back to you, the young widow whose hands weren't clean either. Renard's face shifted, just slightly, the smallest flicker of tension in her jaw. Miss Marple stepped back. You switched the spoon, she said gently. You arrived early. You argued. You waited for your moment. Renard shook her head once, sharply. Number de champ. She's weak, Miss Marple said, but not cruel, not calculated. You planted the spoon in her bag. You knew the police would find it. The church was silent. The candles flickered. Renard whispered, It wasn't justice. It was mercy. But her words fell hollow. The next morning, the authorities moved swiftly, but cautiously. Madame Deschamps was released quietly before breakfast. Renard's arrest was made with less ceremony, though word spread quickly. The village would buzz for weeks. Inspector Delacour, reviewing the case file later, sighed heavily. I was too quick, too willing to believe in tidy endings. Miss Marple sipped her tea. We all like tidy things, but the truth rarely obliges. He looked over at her. How did you know? She tried too hard to stay innocent, and guilt, when buried too long, always leaks from the corners. The case was declared closed. Officially, the press lost interest by week's end. But for the 6 women, now 5, the silence left behind was heavier than ever. Madame Dufresne had tried to bring light. In the end, she'd only made the shadows deeper. Miss Marple packed her things quietly and took the morning train north. There were still other villages, other shadows. Ask ChatGPT. The next morning broke with startling clarity. No fog, no rain, only the unrelenting stillness of a village that had held its breath too long. The sun cut sharp across the cobbles and lit the Dufresne manor in a way that made it look somehow smaller, stripped of its usual mystery. But mystery clung where it always did, not in walls or windows, but in people. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Delacour in his office, watching as he unwrapped the locket she'd found beneath the second cross. He regarded it with a sort of grim satisfaction, like a man beginning to believe the pieces had finally found their places. The locket was buried, he said, intentionally hidden, and the photograph inside, clearly of Madame Dufresne, with someone she once cared for deeply, a man she later erased. Why bury it? To bury what it meant, Miss Marple replied softly, or to prevent others from seeing it. Delacour tapped the scratched-out face. I had it examined. Based on other photographs from the priest's ordination, our expert confirms it's likely Father Dufresne himself, which means Madame Dufresne loved him before or after the vows were broken. And she tried to forget him, Miss Marple murmured, or tried to protect him. Delacour sat back. Combined with the photograph from the boat and the old rumors, it paints a simple story. There was a scandal, perhaps even an affair between the priest and one of the women, a confrontation on the boat. Dufresne intervened. 2 men drowned. The women covered it up. Now one of them feared exposure and silenced Madame Dufresne. He paused, then added, "And now we may know which." He reached into his desk drawer and placed another item on the table, a silver teaspoon. The tip of the handle was slightly tarnished, but the rest gleamed. "It was found in Madame Duchamp's handbag this morning. She was visiting the church, and a cleaner reported her leaving something strange behind. We recovered it. This," he tapped the spoon, "matches the exact pattern of Madame Dufresne's tea set, engraved with the family crest." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "You think she took it during the tea?" Delacour nodded. "Or switched it with another. We sent it to the lab. Trace elements of digitalis on the surface. Poison." The word fell heavy between them. "She poisoned the tea?" Miss Marple asked. "But there was only one pot. Everyone drank from it." Delacour smirked. Perhaps not everyone drank equally, or perhaps Madame Dufresne received a special cup. Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet. An hour later, Madame Deschamps sat in a chair at the gendarmerie, shaking, her hands clenched like brittle claws in her lap. She had not spoken since the arrest, not to the officers, not to the priest who had come to offer her comfort. But when Miss Marple entered, she looked up, eyes shining with something between terror and despair. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "You had motive," Delacour said. "Your husband died under suspicious circumstances. She knew something. She was going to speak." "She already had," Deschamps said. "To me, the night before. She came to my home, said she was tired, said she'd lied too long." Miss Marple leaned in, gently. "What did she tell you?" "That Henri wasn't meant to die," Deschamps said, trembling. "He was pushed, yes, but not by Celeste, by someone else. She said she tried to save him, tried to tell the truth afterward. But the others, they were afraid of what would follow." "So you kept quiet all these years?" Deschamps nodded, eyes wet. "She wasn't threatening me. She was asking forgiveness." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Then why the spoon in your bag?" "I don't know," she said, voice cracking. "I swear I don't. I never touched the tea. I never touched anything." Delacour looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple sat back slowly. Something wasn't right. She returned to the manor that afternoon, seeking Léonie again. The housekeeper answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and an air of wary fatigue. "There's something I didn't mention," she said before Miss Marple could even speak. "The day before the tea, I saw someone else in the house. Someone Madame Dufresne didn't know had come." "Who?" "Madame Renard." Miss Marple blinked. "Are you certain?" "She came early. I heard her arguing with Madame Dufresne, not loud but sharp, about something to do with her husband." That evening Miss Marple returned to the church, where she knew Renard had taken to walking alone at twilight. She found her there, standing in the nave, head bowed, as though in prayer. Miss Marple stepped beside her quietly. "He told you, didn't he? Your husband, before he died." Renard did not move. "About the boat, about what really happened." Renard turned slowly. Her eyes were clear, almost peaceful. "He said they laughed when it happened, said it was a joke, that the priest was angry but not enough to kill. Henri hit his head when he fell. It wasn't planned." "But the priest jumped in after him," Miss Marple said. "And he never came back up either." Renard nodded. "He tried to save Henri, but they panicked. The women. My husband said they held the priest down. He was struggling. Bellamy screamed he'd ruin everything. And Madame Dufresne. She watched. He said she froze, didn't help, didn't scream, just watched. like she'd broken inside. Miss Marple closed her eyes a moment. "And you confronted her?" "I asked her what I was supposed to do with that," Renard said, her voice trembling now. "She told me to let it stay buried, said the truth wouldn't help anyone." "And then?" "She asked me to come to the tea, said it was time to tell the others, that she couldn't hold it alone anymore." Miss Marple met her gaze. "But you didn't want the truth out, did you? Not because of your husband, but because of you. Because the story would circle back to you, the young widow whose hands weren't clean either." Renard's face shifted, just slightly, the smallest flicker of tension in her jaw. Miss Marple stepped back. "You switched the spoon," she said gently. "You arrived early. You argued. You waited for your moment." Renard shook her head once, sharply. "Number de champ. She's weak," Miss Marple said, "but not cruel, not calculated. You planted the spoon in her bag. You knew the police would find it." The church was silent. The candles flickered. Renard whispered, "It wasn't justice. It was mercy." But her words fell hollow. The next morning the authorities moved swiftly but cautiously. Madame Duchamp was released quietly before breakfast. Renard's arrest was made with less ceremony, though word spread quickly. The village would buzz for weeks. Inspector Delacour, reviewing the case file later, sighed heavily. "I was too quick, too willing to believe in tidy endings." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "We all like tidy things, but the truth rarely obliges." He looked over at her. "How did you know?" She tried too hard to stay innocent, and guilt, when buried too long, always leaks from the corners. The case was declared closed. Officially, the press lost interest by week's end. But for the 6 women, now 5, the silence left behind was heavier than ever. Madame Dufresne had tried to bring light. In the end, she'd only made the shadows deeper. Miss Marple packed her things quietly and took the morning train north. There were still other villages, other shadows. The train to Lyon had only just begun to pull away when Miss Marple felt that familiar itch, a tug, subtle yet persistent, at the edge of her thoughts. She had settled herself with a book she would not read, and a view she would not notice, her mind quietly reviewing every step of the case behind her. Madame Renard had confessed in all but name. The evidence was sound, the motive plausible. Inspector Delacour was satisfied. Even the village had begun to slip back into its sleepy rhythms. But something resisted, not loudly, not obviously. A detail, a presence, perhaps, that hadn't been accounted for. Or perhaps someone whose absence had gone unnoticed entirely. She reopened her notebook, turning back to the early pages. The photo of the boat, the letters, the sequence of events leading to the tea. Each woman had been drawn back to Saint-Antoine-le-Haut by a letter. But no one had seen the letter Céleste received, only that she had spoken of it and summoned the others. She had not signed theirs, and she had not kept hers. If Renard had been trying to silence her, why wait? Why go through the trouble of staging a scene at the tea? There were simpler ways, cleaner ones, but Madame Dufresne had insisted on gathering them. She had buried the locket, burnt a note, hidden her husband's Bible. Her actions were deliberate, preparatory. And then there was the rosary. Miss Marple stared at her own notes again. The rosary had been found inside the Bible, but someone had placed the Bible in the garden, not Madame Dufresne. That much she was now certain of. The train slowed outside a rural station, and Miss Marple made her decision. She gathered her bag, stepped off, and quietly took the next train back. By mid-afternoon, she stood once again in the drawing-room of Dufresne Manor. The house, still draped in mourning, seemed oddly relieved to see her return. Léonie greeted her with a startled smile and quickly offered tea, but Miss Marple declined. She asked instead to revisit Madame Dufresne's study. It was there, after nearly an hour of quiet inspection, that she found it, a stack of old parish records wrapped in brown twine, tucked behind volumes of St. Augustine and Thomas à Kempis. She sat down slowly, untied the bundle, and began to read. The pages were brittle and the ink faded, but the names stood out. Father Dufresne officiating marriages, baptizing children, attending funerals. There was nothing unusual at first glance. But further in, there it was. A marriage entry. Henri Deschamps and Claire Fournier, July 1911. Miss Marple froze. Claire Fournier. She had said they were only schoolmates, she and Celeste. She had spoken of the boat trip as if it were someone else's tragedy. But if she had been married to Henri Deschamps, why hide it? Her hands moved faster now, flipping forward. A death record. Henri Deschamps. Presumed drowned. July 1915. Body not recovered. A second marriage. Claire Fournier and Gaston Fournier. October 1918. Miss Marple sat back in the chair. She had lied. Not just about her connection to Celeste, but about the entire foundation of her past. Claire Fournier had been married to the very man whose death set everything in motion. And 3 years after his disappearance, she had remarried, changing her name, her story, her place in the narrative. Celeste had known, of course. That explained the letters, the veiled references to mistakes, calculations, boats. The guilt she had tried to unearth at that tea wasn't only Renard's, it was all of theirs. But more than that, this meant there had been another reason for the tea, a final reckoning, not only about the drowning, but about who had benefited most from its silence. Miss Marple returned to the notary's office, requesting access once more to the household documents. There, in the meticulous estate records, she found the final thread. Celeste's will, amended just weeks before her death. The largest portion of her estate was to go to the church. But there was a codicil, a small, easily overlooked clause, a sum of 10,000 francs to be distributed equally among the surviving widows of those lost aboard the Vérité the night of July 12, 1915. That included Deschamps, but also Dufresne, 2 men, 6 women, all present, and yet one name stood out again. Claire Fournier. She had lost a husband, yes, but gained another, and she alone, among them, stood to receive money under both names. If her first marriage had been acknowledged, unless it had been forgotten, or erased. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village that evening, the light golden against the rooftops. The bells from the church rang softly behind her as she made her way once more to Madame Fournier's house. The widow opened the door herself, elegant even in her austerity. She raised an eyebrow when she saw her visitor. "Back so soon?" "I never quite left," Miss Marple said. Fournier stepped aside. "Then I assume you've come with more questions." "Only one," Miss Marple said gently, "though the answer may carry many." She opened her notebook. "Why did you lie about being married to Henri Deschamps?" There was no immediate reaction, not anger, not denial, just a slow, measured pause, and then the barest hint of a smile. "Because it didn't matter anymore," Fournier said quietly. "I was a child when we married. It lasted barely a year. He drank, gambled, and struck me once across the face. When he died, I thought myself lucky." "But you didn't want Madame Dufresne to remind the others." "She had no right. I remade my life. Henri became a footnote. She wanted to turn him into a ghost that haunted all of us." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You knew about the clause in her will. Only days before the tea, I saw her speaking to the notary. I made inquiries, and if she had told the others about your first marriage—" "She wouldn't have," Fournier said coldly. "Celeste could wound, but she wasn't cruel. She wanted truth, not scandal." but someone else might not have been so restrained. Fournier stiffened. You think I killed her? I think you had the oldest motive, Miss Marple said, to keep the past silent, and the most to lose if it spoke. Fournier said nothing. Outside, a storm had begun to gather. Thunder echoed faintly in the distance. I didn't poison her, she said finally, but I didn't stop what came next. When I saw Renard's cup linger, when I saw her watching the sugar, perhaps I should have said something, but I didn't. I wanted it to happen. Does that make me guilty? Miss Marple didn't answer. She turned, left quietly, and stepped into the night. The past had not only cast shadows, it had rooted itself in the hearts of the women who had tried, each in her own way, to escape it. And now it bore fruit, bitter and tangled. In the silence of the village square, Miss Marple stood still, her umbrella trembling slightly in the wind. The crime had not begun with a murder. It had begun with a silence, and it was silence, once again, that had killed. Miss Marple sat alone that morning in the village bakery cafe, sipping weak coffee and staring across the small square toward the church. The storm had passed in the night, but its residue lingered in the form of puddles and scattered leaves, as though the wind had tried to scrub the village clean, and failed. Her mind turned, again and again, to Claire Fournier's quiet confession, not of guilt, but of complicity, not of action, but of silence. It gnawed at her, not because she believed Fournier had lied, but because the web was too tidy. Renard had administered the poison, Fournier had watched and allowed, Deschamps had suffered, but someone had moved the Bible, someone had hidden the locket, and someone, possibly a different someone, had sent that unsigned letter to Madame Dufresne. There were too many small manipulations, too many layers. If silence had killed Celeste, as Miss Marple now believed, then it had not been the silence of one. It had been orchestrated. She stood, thanked the baker's wife, and made her way to the church. Inside, the sanctuary was empty except for a man lighting candles near the altar. Father Renaud, thin and kind-eyed, looked up and greeted her with a soft smile. I was told you'd left. I had, Miss Marple said, but one does get a sense when things are unfinished. He chuckled. That is the story of every churchyard. She approached him slowly. May I ask you something, Father? Did Madame Dufresne confess anything to you in the weeks before she died? His hands paused. I cannot speak of confessions, Miss Marple. You understand? Of course, but you may speak of what is not sacred, what is observed. Was she afraid? He thought a moment, then nodded. Yes, but not for herself. She came often in her final month, sat in the third pew. She brought a journal, though I never saw her write in it. She seemed unsettled, as if circling something she could not bring herself to face. Did she ever ask about her husband? She asked once about the nature of forgiveness, whether it could be forced. I told her no, that it had to be given freely. She said something curious then. Then I suppose I'll have to choose my audience more carefully. I assumed it was philosophical. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you know where she kept the journal? She never left it behind, though she once asked if the church's baptismal records had ever been copied. I told her yes, they were all digitized some years ago. Miss Marple turned this over. If she had been researching the past, she had done so with great discretion. But what had she been looking for? Not her husband's sins, those were known to her. Not the incident on the boat. She had lived it. No, it had to be something more recent, a shadow lingering after the death, rather than before. On her way out, she stopped at the old oak bulletin board in the church vestibule. Tacked among the announcements and scripture verses was a black and white photograph of the congregation taken the year before, one of those celebratory portraits marking the church's centenary. She leaned in. There they all were, Leclerc, Bellamy, Deschamps, even Renard in the back. All in attendance, though none stood near each other, a line of polite separations. And then she saw it. In the background, half-turned, almost out of frame, was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, familiar, wearing a suit just a little too fine for the occasion. She stepped closer. She had seen that man before, in the locket, not Father Dufresne, the other, Henri Deschamps. Her pulse skipped. If the date on the photo was correct, Henri Deschamps had been seen in public last year, which meant either the death record was forged, or he hadn't drowned at all. She made her way directly to the gendarmerie, where Delacour received her with weary civility. When she showed him the photograph, his eyebrows climbed. "That man is supposed to be dead." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and yet there he is in front of your very church." He frowned. The Deschamps file was closed decades ago. No body recovered, declared dead by the mayor at the time. But if he reappeared, he may never have left. He could have assumed a new identity, disappeared into another life. Delacour stood. "I'll have our records reviewed. Facial comparison. But if what you say is true, then we must test someone," Miss Marple said, "not for guilt, but for recognition." She returned to the Dufresne manor, where Bellamy, Leclerc, and Deschamps had gathered again. With the case solved, they'd begun to circle one another warily, discussing funeral arrangements and estate dispersals. Miss Marple entered without ceremony, carrying the church photo tucked inside an envelope. "Ladies," she said pleasantly, "I've come across something interesting. The church held a centenary last year, and you were all present. I thought you might help me identify someone in this photograph." She laid the photo on the table. They leaned in. Deschamps barely glanced. Leclerc squinted and shrugged. But Bellamy froze. Her eyes locked on the background figure, and her fingers dug into the armrest of her chair before she caught herself. The reaction was barely a second, but Miss Marple saw it, a precise, uncontrollable jolt. "You know him," Miss Marple said softly. Bellamy blinked. "What? No, of course not." "He was your lover once, wasn't he? Before the boat, before Celeste, before everything." Bellamy's expression curdled. "That was 50 years ago. So you admit it? What does it matter now?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because someone declared him dead, and someone helped him stay that way." Deschamps, pale now, murmured, "He didn't drown?" Bellamy stood abruptly. "This is nonsense." "He returned last year," Miss Marple pressed. "Perhaps to see Celeste, perhaps to blackmail someone, perhaps to rekindle something." Bellamy's voice was cold. "And now you think he killed her?" "I think she found out. I think she knew he was alive, and that someone in this room had helped fake his death." Bellamy laughed, sharp and brittle. "You think I've been hiding a ghost for 30 years? I think you've been hiding the fact that he didn't drown because it suited you, because it spared you scandal. And I think when Celeste threatened to reveal it, someone silenced her, not out of panic but out of calculation." There was silence in the room, thick and jagged. Then Bellamy said, "He came back. For money, for forgiveness. I told him to stay away." "You told Celeste," Miss Marple said. "That's why she called the others. That's why she wanted it all on the table. Because he hadn't haunted her. You had." Bellamy turned slowly. "And what now? Will you dig him up from whatever ditch he's crawled into?" "I don't need to," Miss Marple said. "You already did." The room remained still, but in that stillness, something cracked. An old deceit, long preserved, suddenly revealed by one simple thing. A photograph and the recognition no one could fake. The story was changing. The past wasn't done. The sky over Saint-Antoine-le-Haut was thick with clouds again, though this time no storm came. It was a silence charged with tension, the kind that precedes a decision, or a confession, or the collapse of something long held together by lies. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village square, her steps careful, thoughts racing. Bellamy's face, her brief, involuntary recognition of the man in the church photograph, had shifted everything. Henri Deschamps had not drowned, not in 1915. He had returned, and someone, perhaps several someones, had known it. At the gendarmerie, Inspector Delacour had agreed to pull the old case files on Deschamps. He had promised to arrange a comparison between the church photograph and archived military ID records. Miss Marple had left the photo with him, her only copy, and walked away that morning with the faintest weight lifted from her shoulders. But when she returned the next afternoon to follow up, Delacour greeted her not with satisfaction, but tight-lipped concern. "I was going to contact you," he said, ushering her into his office. "There's been an incident." The photo was gone. The file drawer where it had been stored, locked, sealed, standard procedure, had been pried open. Only one folder was missing. No other files disturbed. No signs of forced entry. No witnesses. Just silence and absence. "Impossible," Delacour muttered, staring at the drawer like it had betrayed him. "The station never closes fully. There's always someone here." Miss Marple sat down without speaking. She folded her gloved hands neatly in her lap, eyes fixed not on the desk, but on the floor, on the empty place where something important had been, and now was not. "When was the last time you saw the file?" she asked calmly. "Just before noon yesterday," Delacour said. "I left it on the desk for 10 minutes, had to speak to a clerk in the next room. When I came back, I returned it to the drawer. Locked it myself, I'm sure of it." "And who knew it was there?" Delacour exhaled. "Only you, me, and my clerk, Etienne. He's been here 6 years, loyal, sharp. I can't believe he would—" "No," Miss Marple said, interrupting gently. "Of course not. But perhaps someone else made him believe it wasn't important, or convinced him to step away." Delacour frowned. "You think one of the widows?" "I think one of them understood what that photograph meant," she said, "and that without it, we are left with only memory and suggestion." Delacour ran a hand through his thinning hair. "We'll search every desk, every bin. I'll check who accessed the building last night." Miss Marple nodded, but she already knew what she would find, or rather what she wouldn't. Later that afternoon, she returned to the manor, stopping first at the garden where the locket had been buried. The second cross, smaller, cruder, was now gone. Uprooted, no sign of disturbance in the soil, no trace of linen or metal, as if it had never existed. She stood there a long while, listening to the hush of the wind against the rose bushes. Someone was erasing, not hiding, but unwriting the past. Inside, the remaining widows were gathered again: Bellamy, Leclerc, Deschamps. They had taken to drinking tea together each afternoon, an odd ritual of forced civility. Miss Marple entered without announcement, as was her growing habit. "Has anyone seen Léonie?" she asked. "I came to speak with her, but I was told she left early." "She went to see her sister," Leclerc said, "a few villages over." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That's odd. She mentioned she had no living family left." Deschamps blinked. "She said the same to me." Bellamy looked up sharply. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple smiled lightly. "Only that Léonie may not be as invisible as we've assumed." The room fell quiet. A tremor of unease passed between them, though no one spoke it aloud. They had all known her, yes, but none had truly seen her. After a pause, Miss Marple asked, "Do any of you recall her being present at the church photo?" The question caught them off guard. "I don't think so," said Leclerc slowly. "I do," said Deschamps. "She helped set up the chairs. She wasn't in the picture, though. Are you sure? Miss Marple asked. I think so. It was all such a blur. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, watching how Bellamy avoided her gaze. After a time, she excused herself and walked back to the village, stopping at the church again. Father Renaud was sweeping leaves from the front steps. He looked up with surprise. You're tireless, Miss Marple. Hardly, she said, but the past seems unusually stubborn here. She asked to see the church's archive room, the dusty alcove where old photographs and service bulletins were stored. With his help, she combed through the drawers until she found the negatives from the centenary event. 2 rolls carefully labeled. One contained the official group portrait. The other, spare frames, candid shots taken before and after the gathering. She held one strip up to the light, and there it was again. The man in the suit, this time not half-turned, full face, laughing, holding a cigarette, and beside him, she squinted, a woman, face turned, slight, with a scarf tied over her head, a housekeeper's apron barely visible beneath her coat. Léonie. She was speaking to him. 2 days later, Inspector Delacour summoned her back to the station. Etienne, the clerk, had resigned that morning. No explanation, only a note. In it, he admitted someone had bribed him to misplace the file for 24 hours. Enough time to make it vanish. He didn't know their name. He'd never seen their face. Only that it was a woman, someone with a veil, someone who spoke with certainty. Miss Marple read the note and folded it once. She's covering for him, she said softly. Léonie, Delacour asked. But why? To protect someone she believed had been wronged. The final piece was beginning to form. Not poison, not spite, not even revenge, but loyalty. Miss Marple returned to the manor one last time. It was late, the corridors dim, the house still with a hush that felt deeper than quiet. She found Léonie in the kitchen, wiping down the same counter she had wiped 100 times before. Loyalty is a strange thing, Miss Marple said. Léonie didn't look up. It is. You saw him, didn't you, when he returned? Henri. Léonie's hands stopped moving. I was in love with him once, she whispered, before Claire, before Celeste, before all of them. Miss Marple stepped closer. You hit him, after the accident, after the others let him fall. They didn't save him, Léonie said. So I did. And you helped him stay dead. I thought I could keep him, just for myself. In the cottage behind the vineyard. No one went there. Not for years. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And when he came back last year, he wanted money, forgiveness. I told him not to come here, but he did. He saw Celeste, and she changed, said she had to make things right. She buried the locket, Miss Marple said, and told him she would expose the truth. Léonie looked down. She meant well, but he didn't deserve her mercy. So you warned Bellamy? A pause, then a slow nod. I didn't poison her, Léonie said. But I told Claire everything, and Claire did what she always does. She calculated outside. The wind had risen again. But this time it carried no storm, only the slow erosion of a lie that had lasted too long. It was just past midnight when the scream broke across the village. Miss Marple had been lying awake in the guest room above the inn, the quilt drawn up to her chin, eyes fixed on the ceiling as the recent revelations spun and wove themselves into unsettling patterns. She knew there was more, always more. Loyalty, as she had told Léonie, was strange, but so too was guilt, and guilt, she had learned, was rarely linear. It didn't belong solely to those who acted, but often to those who stood by, those who helped conceal the consequence of others' choices. The scream came from the north edge of the square, a single piercing sound, cut off abruptly. Miss Marple was already upright, dressing by habit more than thought. Within minutes, she was walking briskly toward the source, slippered feet splashing through shallow puddles, her shawl wrapped tightly against the night air. Other windows had opened, lights flickered on. The village had roused. She found the small crowd outside Bellamy's house. 2 constables had already arrived, called by the maid who stood shivering in the doorway, pale and near collapse. Delacour arrived just behind her, his uniform jacket askew, hair still wet from a hasty wash. She was found in the parlor, he told Miss Marple, lowering his voice, lying on the rug. No sign of forced entry, no broken glass, but the back door was ajar. Inside, the house was oppressively still. The parlor was dim but unmistakably disturbed. The armchair was overturned, one of the vases shattered against the hearth. Bellamy lay slumped near the fireplace, her eyes open in glassy disbelief. A dark stain spread across her bodice. There was no blood on her hands, no signs of a struggle. She had been stabbed. Once, cleanly. Miss Marple leaned over the body. The expression was not surprise. It was recognition. "She knew the killer," she said softly. Delacour crouched beside her. "It doesn't fit. Why now? We were closing in." "No," she murmured. "We thought we were closing in, but someone was watching, listening, and they knew we were too close." Delacour stood. "And now the strongest voice in the room is gone." Miss Marple's mind began working quickly. Bellamy had known about Henri. She had helped suppress the truth, but it was never entirely clear why. Not until Léonie had spoken. She had loved him once. So had Claire. So, perhaps, had Celeste. It had never been about a single man. It was about what he represented, what they had built together, this strange sorority of loss and survival, and what would happen if that foundation crumbled. "She was silenced," Miss Marple said aloud, as the coroner arrived. "Just as Celeste was, but not for the same reason." Delacour raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" "She knew something," Miss Marple said, "not just about the past, but about what's still to come." The next day dawned cold and gray, and the village moved in hushed whispers. 2 deaths in as many weeks. The 6 widows were now 3. Deschamps, Leclerc, and Fournier. Each had been quiet since Bellamy's death. Too quiet. Miss Marple asked to see them again, this time in the chapel beneath the church, a place that felt older than the village itself. The priest agreed without hesitation, and the women arrived with wary curiosity. Deschamps was pale, nervous. Leclerc, stiff as always, arms folded in cautious defiance. Fournier, perfectly composed. "I won't waste your time," Miss Marple said calmly. "You've each told stories, partial truths, convenient omissions, but now another woman is dead, and I intend to stop the next." Leclerc spoke first. "Do you mean one of us is next?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I mean one of you is responsible." They stared at her. "You've all acted out of fear, fear of the truth, fear of scandal. But the person we're dealing with now isn't afraid of truth. They're afraid of losing control." Fournier's voice was ice. "Are you accusing me again, Miss Marple?" "Not accusing," she replied gently, "but considering." She took from her handbag a folded sheet, the final photograph she had developed from the negatives in the church archive. She held it out. "This was taken after the centenary mass. You all remember it. But look closely. Who is missing?" They examined it, confused. Deschamps frowned. "It's just the congregation." "No, look again." Leclerc's eyes widened. "Where's Léonie?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. She was there. She was seen setting up chairs, serving drinks, but in none of the photos does she appear." "She was always in the background," Deschamps whispered. "Or just out of frame," Miss Marple said. "She made sure of it, because she was watching, not as a bystander, as a participant." Fournier stepped back. "You think Léonie killed Claire?" "I think Miss Marple said quietly, that Léonie loved Henri Deschamps, loved him more deeply and more destructively than she let on. When he reappeared, older, bitter, and cruel, she tried to hide him again, out of some misplaced loyalty, but Celeste wanted him exposed, Claire wanted him gone, Bellamy wanted him silenced. Leclerc muttered, then it could have been any of them. But Bellamy didn't kill him, Miss Marple said. Someone else did. Weeks ago. Before the tea. Fournier narrowed her eyes. You think he's dead now? I think Léonie killed him the moment she realized he was never coming back to her. And then she began cleaning up. First the past, then the people who knew too much of it. Deschamps whispered, Celeste, Claire. She saw them as traitors, Miss Marple said, or threats. She removed the Bible, the locket, the photograph. She bribed the clerk. And when she couldn't control what Bellamy would reveal, she removed her too. Leclerc's voice was dry. And now? Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the narrow stone steps leading back up to the chapel. Her voice was calm but iron-threaded. Now she will come for you, for whoever's next, because this story isn't about love or loyalty or even justice anymore. It's about possession. Even as she spoke, a constable burst into the chamber, face pale. He turned to Delacour, who had stood quietly behind her. She's gone, sir, he said. Léonie, her cottage is empty, bed unslept, no trace. Miss Marple closed her eyes. She had not fled. She had begun. Again. The morning light seeped through the lace curtains of the village inn's parlor, where Miss Marple had taken temporary refuge. The steady drip of rain outside seemed to slow the world, but inside her mind, everything was sharpening into focus. Léonie's disappearance, Bellamy's murder, the stolen photograph, all pieces in a puzzle that stubbornly refused to lie still until the final image emerged. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, fingers steepled as she reviewed her mental map of the events and characters tangled in this web. The village seemed small, its geography well known, but the labyrinth of secrets stretched far beyond any map's borders. She recalled the faces she had studied, each widow bearing her own brand of grief, guilt, and carefully curated innocence. Yet beneath the surface, small gestures and words lingered. Bellamy's flinch at the church photograph, Fournier's poised evasiveness, Leclerc's sudden silence when Léonie's name was mentioned, Deschamps' trembling hands when speaking of his long-lost husband, and Léonie herself, always present yet unseen, caretaker and conspirator, keeper of shadows. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window where the rain had slowed to a fine mist. It was then that the stray remark made by the village baker, just 2 days earlier, resurfaced. Funny how Léonie always wore the same perfume, even on the coldest days. Something floral, but with a hint of smoke. Made the air thick, they said. She reached for her notebook, flipping back to the entry. A perfume. An odd thing to mention, but the baker's words had stuck with her. Some fragrance no one else seemed to notice. Lingering, clinging, marking a presence. And then another recollection. From a conversation with the notary. He had mentioned Léonie's habit of always carrying a small handkerchief, embroidered with a strange motif, a single dark thorn curling around a faded letter C. The monogram belonged not to Léonie, but to Claire Fournier. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The handkerchief had never been accounted for during the search of Léonie's belongings. And the scent, smoky floral, suggested an association with something else entirely. She had also remembered the brittle ash found scattered near the garden where the second cross had been buried. What if Léonie had burned something there, something she wanted destroyed without a trace? Determined, Miss Marple rose and made her way once again to the church archives. This time she was alone, granted free access by Father Renaud, who had come to respect her quiet tenacity. In the back room, Amidst yellowed pages and forgotten documents, she found the parish's ledger of gifts and donations. Her eyes scanned the pages carefully until she found a name, Léonie Martel. There, recorded nearly 30 years ago, was a large sum donated to the church, a sum far beyond what a housekeeper's salary could explain. Alongside was a note for the restoration of the altar in memory of Claire Fournier. Miss Marple's breath caught. Léonie was not merely a servant. She had been a benefactor deeply tied to Claire, perhaps in gratitude or in penance. She turned to Father Renaud. "Did Léonie ever mention this to you?" He shook his head. "Never a word. She was a quiet woman, always working in the shadows." Miss Marple pondered this. Could Léonie's loyalty have stemmed not just from love for Henri, but from reverence for Claire? And if so, what did that mean for the other widows? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a soft rustle from the corner. She turned to see a small leather pouch on the floor just beneath the window. Kneeling, she picked it up carefully. Inside was a collection of old letters, folded and tied with a thin ribbon. The handwriting was delicate, elegant, the unmistakable script of Claire Fournier. Miss Marple unfolded the first letter. It was addressed to Léonie. "You carry more than you know. The truth must be protected, but not at the cost of our souls. Trust no one but me." The next letter was dated 6 months later. "They watch. They listen. Bellamy's fear grows, but so does her resolve. We must act before she speaks. Henri's secret must die with us." Another, this time written hastily. "Léonie, if I do not return, keep the locket safe. It is the key to everything. Do not let it fall into the wrong hands." The last letter was only a fragment cut off mid-sentence. "And if the past comes knocking again, remind them that some wounds never heal. The cross must bear the burden." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The locket, the cross, the letters, they were all parts of a ritual, a covenant among the women to protect a secret darker than a simple affair or a faked death. The letters revealed a plan, not just to conceal Henri's survival, but to control the narrative that had trapped them all. Bellamy's murder was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated act to silence dissent. Miss Marple carefully refolded the letters. The pattern was clear now. Léonie was the keeper of this pact, willing to sacrifice anyone who threatened its sanctity. But there was one detail that made her pause. The embroidered thorn on the handkerchief, a symbol not only of pain, but of sacrifice. It matched the motif on the locket, faintly visible under a magnifying glass in her earlier notes. The key to the mystery had been there all along, in these small symbols, these hidden gestures of devotion and betrayal. Suddenly, the door creaked. Miss Marple looked up to see Inspector Delacour entering, face drawn. "We have news," he said. "Leclaire was found in the vineyard this morning, unconscious but alive. She was attacked." Miss Marple stood slowly, a grim smile touching her lips. "The pattern is unfolding," she said. "The shadows are tightening." She had seen the faintest thread of light, but now, more than ever, the danger was real. The web was closing, and only by understanding the smallest details, the scent of smoke, the embroidered thorn, could the truth be unraveled before it claimed another victim. The air in the small village was thick with unease as Miss Marple made her way slowly down the dirt path toward the vineyard where Leclaire had been found. The first rays of dawn filtered weakly through heavy clouds, casting a pale light over the dew-soaked vines. The familiar landscape felt sinister now, every shadow lengthened, every rustle amplified in her mind. Leclaire was being tended to in the small cottage at the vineyard's edge, where the local doctor had set up a makeshift infirmary. The wounds were not life-threatening, but the attack was violent enough to suggest the assailant's determination. Miss Marple was allowed to sit beside her when the woman stirred, eyes fluttering open with confusion and fear. Leclerc's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling as she said, "They came for the letters, said they had to be destroyed." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "Who, my dear? Who came for them?" Leclerc's gaze flickered to the window as if seeing shadows beyond the glass. "Leonie. She said the secret was poison, that the past had to be buried or it would kill us all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. This was confirmation of her suspicion. The crime was far more than a tangled affair or hidden money. It was a desperate attempt to contain a secret too dangerous to reveal. Later, in the privacy of the village inn's parlor, Miss Marple gathered with Inspector Delacour and the remaining widows, their faces drawn and pale, as if the weight of their own histories pressed upon them. She unfolded the letters once more and laid them carefully on the table. "This," she said, "is the heart of what has torn you apart." She pointed to a passage in one of Claire's letters, words full of foreboding. "Some wounds never heal. The cross must bear the burden." "What wounds?" Fournier asked, voice brittle. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "Not wounds of the flesh, but of the spirit. Betrayal that no amount of time could mend. Henri Deschamps was not just a man lost to the sea. He was the keeper of a secret that could ruin you all." Bellamy's daughter, who had come quietly to sit in a corner, shifted nervously. "What secret?" she asked. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The secret of a crime buried long ago. Something Henri witnessed. Something he tried to escape by vanishing, but it followed him like a shadow." Delacour interjected, "Are you saying Henri was involved in a crime? That's why he disappeared." "More than involved," Miss Marple said. "He was the unwitting pawn in a tragedy, an act of violence that destroyed an innocent life, one that each of you had a reason to keep hidden." She turned to Bellamy, whose face was now drawn and pale. "You spoke of fear and scandal. What was the scandal?" Bellamy's voice cracked as she spoke, the years of silence breaking free. "Henri was there the night Sylvain Moreau died. They argued badly. Henri tried to stop it, but it went too far. It was an accident, but everyone believed Henri had something to do with it. The village whispered. The gendarmerie investigated, and then he vanished." Miss Marple nodded. "But the truth was something else entirely. Sylvain Moreau's death was a cover for another crime, one committed by those closest to you. The secret that Henri tried to hold on to was dangerous because it implicated more than one person." Leclerc's breath hitched. "So we all had reasons to silence Henri, to keep his secret buried. And Claire, when she returned, tried to make it right," Miss Marple said. "But Leonie, bound by loyalty and fear, decided that silence was safer than truth." The room was silent, heavy with the weight of confession. "Why kill now?" Fournier whispered. "Why this violence after all these years?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "Leonie feared exposure. She feared the unraveling of the past would destroy what remained of her life. The letters you found were her last attempt to control the narrative. When Bellamy threatened to speak, Leonie acted. When Leclerc got too close, she silenced her with fear." Delacour's eyes darkened. "But Leonie fled. She's still out there." Miss Marple stood, folding the letters carefully. "And she will do anything to protect her secret. The deeper motive isn't money nor revenge alone. It is survival, the desperate, suffocating fear that the past will consume the present." She looked around the room at the women she had come to know, all bound by love, loss, and the fragile threads of shared history. Understanding this is key, not just to solving the crime, but to healing what has been broken. As she spoke, a sudden noise at the window caught their attention. Outside, in the gray morning light, a figure slipped away into the mist. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The shadows are not done with us yet. The true motive, fear of truth, and the lengths to which one will go to bury it, hung heavy in the air, a silent menace waiting to strike again. Evening settled over Saint-Antoine-le-Haut like a velvet curtain drawn by hesitant hands. The storm that had threatened all day never quite came, but the air was thick, trembling with anticipation, like the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple moved deliberately through the cobbled square, her cane clicking softly against stone, her shawl tight against the wind. Everything was in place. Léonie had not vanished as thoroughly as she had hoped. Miss Marple had traced her movements in the margins, in borrowed footsteps, in the way doors were left ajar, in candles half burnt and a scent of smoke drifting from places it did not belong. The pattern was unmistakable now. Léonie had not fled in fear. She had retreated like a predator, waiting for the moment to finish what she had started. Miss Marple had chosen the chapel for the final act. It was fitting. A place built for confession, for silence, for absolution. Father Renaud had been kind enough to let her use it, offering no questions when she asked to light the candelabras and arrange the chairs in a circle beneath the high, arched windows. He would not be present tonight. That, too, had been arranged. The 3 remaining widows had been summoned under the pretense of a final meeting, an effort to share everything, as Miss Marple had phrased it. Deschamps, Leclerc, Fournier, each had arrived with guarded expressions, unsure of what to expect, but too entangled now to refuse. They sat now, uneasy, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows behind them. Miss Marple stood before them near the altar, her voice calm, steady. "I've asked you here," she said, "not because I need answers. I have them, every last one, but because the truth must be spoken aloud before it's buried again." The women exchanged uncertain glances. "It began with Henri Deschamps," Miss Marple continued. "Or so we thought, but really it began with Sylvain Moreau the night he died. That was the first fracture, the first silence." Leclerc closed her eyes. Deschamps hunched his shoulders. Only Fournier remained still. "And Henri," Miss Marple went on, "was the scapegoat. He vanished, not just out of fear, but at your urging. You told him to go, all of you, because if he stayed, he would bring down the house you'd built together. No one denied it. Claire tried to undo that wrong when he returned," she said, "but she underestimated the strength of old pacts, and Bellamy, fearful, proud, loyal to no one but the version of the past she had accepted, chose to silence her. She turned then slowly toward the rear of the chapel, and you, Léonie, stood behind them all." There was a soft creak behind the last pew, and then she stepped into the light. Léonie, dressed in gray, her face paler than ever, hair pinned tightly. Her expression was not defiant, it was resigned. "I told you to leave it be," Léonie said. "It was over, long ago." "No," Miss Marple said. "You only thought it was, but history does not decay in silence, Léonie. It ferments." Léonie's gaze swept the room, pausing on each of the women she had once served, once protected, once loved in her own way. "They were going to destroy everything," she said. "Henri wanted money, Claire wanted redemption, Bellamy wanted power, and I just wanted to be left in peace." Miss Marple stepped closer. "You killed Henri. You buried his body behind the cottage. Then when Celeste threatened to expose it, you poisoned her. And when Claire began asking questions, when she started remembering, she became a threat too." Léonie's jaw clenched. She was going to ruin all of them. And for what? So she could sleep at night? "You killed Bellamy," Miss Marple said softly, "not out of revenge, out of necessity, because she was going to confess. She had already told me she was tired, that the guilt was heavier than her pride." Leonie didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at the flickering flame of a nearby candle. "I saved them all. I held it together." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "You bound them to a lie. You mistook silence for safety and loyalty for love." At that, Leonie's face broke, just a little. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but something more dangerous. Grief, loss, the kind that had calcified over decades. "They were my life," she whispered. "I scrubbed their floors. I washed their linens. I buried their sins. And in return, they gave me nothing." Miss Marple's voice softened. "You wanted to be seen, and you were, Leonie, just not in the way you needed." The room was still. The other women watched, stunned, not angry, not afraid. Something like sorrow passed between them. Then Leonie stepped forward, her hands unclenched. "So what happens now?" Delacour emerged from the side aisle. He had been waiting, just out of sight. Leonie didn't flinch as the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Miss Marple watched her calmly. "Now the past finally breathes, and perhaps so can we." Leonie said nothing as she was led away. The chapel was silent again. Deschamps stood slowly. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "We did let her carry it, all of it." Fournier nodded. "And we let ourselves believe that guilt could be delegated." Miss Marple gathered the letters from the pew. "Guilt can be shared," she said, "but redemption must be earned." Outside, the wind had changed. A lighter breeze now. The weight in the village had shifted. The lie that had bound them was broken, not cleanly, but completely. Miss Marple stepped into the night, knowing the worst was behind them. But the truth, like the morning, would take time to rise. The morning after Leonie's arrest, Saint-Antoine-le-Haut basked in a soft, tentative light. The village had exhaled, a long-held breath finally released after decades of tightly wound silence. The remaining widows kept mostly indoors, and even the innkeeper, normally chatty at breakfast, served Miss Marple her tea in near reverence, as though speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile peace had settled. Inspector Delacour arrived mid-morning. His demeanor was calm, but Miss Marple could sense something had unsettled him. He joined her at the small table by the window, where she was reviewing the last of Claire Fournier's letters one more time, as if reluctant to let them go. "There's been a development," he said, lowering his voice. "Leonie has confessed. Everything. Henri's death, the poisonings, the fire she set in the archives. She even admitted to forging entries in the church registry to confuse the timeline." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It fits her pattern. Control through shadows. She spent a lifetime tending to secrets, like a gardener tends roses, pruning the past." Delacour hesitated, then placed a folded note on the table. "But then there's this. It was found under Claire Fournier's floorboards this morning. The current tenants had planned to renovate. They called us when they found a locked metal box hidden beneath the hearth. This was inside." Miss Marple unfolded the paper with deliberate care. It was a single sheet, written in Claire's hand. "If you are reading this, it means I have failed, or changed my mind, or worse. Leonie is dangerous, yes, but she is not alone. The truth has always been more complicated. I made mistakes, we all did. But the person truly responsible for what happened to Sylvain is still among us. Watch her. She wears grief like a second skin, and she has fooled us all." Miss Marple read the note twice, then again. Her expression remained unchanged, but Delacour saw the storm behind her eyes. "She doesn't name anyone," he said quietly. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but she doesn't have to." She rose from the table, slipping the letter into her handbag, her steps now purposeful. "Where is Deschamps?" "Back at her home," Delacour said. "She hasn't left since the chapel." Miss Marple's lips tightened. Good. Then it's time we asked her one more question. Deschamps' cottage was a small, neat structure tucked behind the bakery. The shutters were closed, the door slightly ajar, as if waiting. Miss Marple entered first, Delacour at her side. The living room was dim. Deschamps sat in an armchair near the hearth, her cane across her lap, a fire burning low despite the warmth outside. She did not look surprised to see them. "You've come back," she said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "because there's something that still doesn't make sense." Deschamps tilted her head. Léonie confessed. "Isn't that enough?" "For most people, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but Claire's note suggests otherwise. And there was one detail, just one, that's been troubling me since the beginning." Deschamps met her gaze, steady and unreadable. "The Bible," Miss Marple said. "The one Claire always carried. It was found in Bellamy's house, but Bellamy told me she hadn't seen Claire for weeks before her death." "So how did it get there?" Deschamps said nothing. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "there's the second cross in the garden. Léonie didn't plant that. She didn't know about it. But someone else did. Someone who wanted to shift suspicion, to make Léonie seem unhinged, desperate." Delacour shifted. "You think Deschamps planted the second cross?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She turned instead to Deschamps. "You've always been the quiet one, the survivor. Everyone thought you were the victim of Henri's cruelty, but you were never his victim, were you?" Deschamps' expression did not waver. Her hands rested calmly on the cane. "He wasn't kind to me. You saw the scar." "I did," Miss Marple said, "but scars are not always the truth. They are symbols, and symbols can lie, just like letters, just like memories." She took Claire's letter from her bag and placed it gently on the side table. "Claire feared you," she said, "not Léonie, not entirely. It was you she named, without naming. She wears grief like a second skin. That's you, isn't it?" Still Deschamps said nothing. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You were the one who killed Sylvain Moreau. Henri tried to stop you. You blamed him. The village believed you, but Claire knew. And Léonie, loyal, foolish Léonie, did what she always did. She covered it up." Deschamps' fingers curled around the handle of the cane. Her voice, when it came, was low and laced with a kind of tired bitterness. "He was going to leave me. For Sylvain. Did you know that? My husband. After everything. He was going to run off with a man 20 years younger. Said he'd had enough pretending." Delacour blinked. "You killed him for that?" Deschamps laughed softly. "Number I killed him because he mocked me when I begged him to stay." Miss Marple said nothing. She only waited. "He called me weak, said I was too dull to deserve anything else. So I waited until he passed out in the garden, drunk from the celebration wine. And I made sure he never woke up." She stared into the fire. "I told the others he left me, that I didn't know where he'd gone. And then the rumors began, and Henri's name came up. And it was so easy to let it stick, and Léonie protected me, because she thought it would save us all." Miss Marple said quietly, "But when Henri returned, you knew the lie was at risk. You couldn't have him remembered as the wronged one." Deschamps nodded slowly. "So I started planting seeds, doubts. I knew Léonie would do the rest." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of it all settled, not with drama, but with sorrow. The final piece of the puzzle had not been a scream or a clue. It had been silence, and that silence had cost too many lives. Delacour stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Deschamps did not resist. She stood with quiet dignity, her cane left leaning against the chair. As she was led out into the daylight, Miss Marple turned back toward the empty cottage. The fire crackled low behind her. The case had twisted itself in ways only grief and guilt could manage, and in the end, it had not been just one crime, but layers, buried, rotting, overlapping like old wallpaper. But now the past was exposed, raw, painful, and free. The sun was beginning to sink behind the hills of Saint-Antoine-le-Haut, casting long amber shadows across the square. A hush had settled over the village, not the nervous quiet of secrecy, but something softer, like reverence. Something had ended, but something else, perhaps unknowable, had only just begun. In the rectory parlor, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching Inspector Delacour escort Deschamps into the waiting police car. The older woman stepped into the vehicle without resistance. No protests, no tears. Only a faint, almost imperceptible smile had crossed her lips as the cuffs clicked shut, as if surrendering was its own kind of release. The door shut, the car pulled away, and the moment passed. Miss Marple turned to the few familiar faces gathered behind her. Fournier, Leclerc, Father Renaud. The others had chosen solitude or shame. Some wounds required privacy to even begin healing. "It's done, then," said Leclerc. Her voice trembled with exhaustion, though her posture was upright. "No," Miss Marple said softly, walking toward the hearth, where the last of the fire's warmth still clung to the room. "Only revealed. Justice is never as simple as an arrest, my dear. It is a long and winding thing. But the truth, yes, that has come to light." Fournier lowered herself slowly into a chair, hands clasped over her knees. "I don't understand how she kept it all hidden for so long." "She didn't," Miss Marple replied. "Not truly. There were signs all along, just small enough to ignore. But they spoke volumes if you listened." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small notepad, its pages thick with scribbles, notes, fragments of overheard conversations, and misremembered confessions. She held it loosely as she spoke. "It began with Sylvain Moreau's death. Everyone accepted it as misadventure, an accident, or a disappearance. But Deschamps told conflicting stories. She couldn't recall which day he vanished. Sometimes it was the night after a fete, other times during a storm. Grief clouds memory, yes, but not motive." She paced gently, voice steady, even gentle. "Then there was the scar. She showed it too freely, spoke of it too often, as if it were the only evidence she had that Henri had been cruel. But real victims often hide their wounds. They don't lead with them. I've known women who bore far worse and never breathed a word." Leclerc looked down at her lap, visibly shaken. "Deschamps never cried," Miss Marple continued. "Not once, even when Henri's bones were found. And when I confronted her in the chapel, she wasn't surprised. She already knew the truth was rising. That's why she planted the second cross, to nudge suspicion in Léonie's direction. She knew Léonie's guilt over covering up Henri's death would overwhelm her." "But why confess now?" Fournier asked. "She could have stayed silent. Léonie would have taken the blame." Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. "Because guilt corrodes from the inside out. And after all the others were gone or ruined, Henri, Bellamy, Claire, she had no one left to protect her from herself. She didn't confess for us. She confessed to be free." Delacour entered the room then, removing his hat respectfully. "She'll be held until transport arrives tomorrow. Given her age and confession, it's likely the court will seek a quiet resolution. The Crown has little interest in scandal." "No," said Miss Marple, "but the truth matters more than scandal. Let the village remember what lies behind lace curtains and polite silences." Delacour gave her a long look, then nodded. "You were right, you know, every step. Even when I thought we'd finished, you kept looking." Miss Marple offered a polite smile. "That's because it wasn't the crime I was chasing, Inspector. It was the motive, and until you find the root, the branches only grow back." Father Renaud, who had remained quiet throughout, now stepped forward. Will you stay for the mass tomorrow? For Henri, for Claire? Miss Marple considered, then gently shook her head. I think this village needs to begin its healing without me. My place is in observation, not legacy. The silence that followed was full, not empty, the kind of silence that holds understanding. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple made her way slowly toward the church, one final time. She walked past the vineyard where the second cross had once stood, past the hollow where Henri's body had been found, past the gardens still fragrant with lavender and loss. She stopped before the weather-worn bench overlooking the valley. There had been a moment, a brief, strange moment, during Deschamps' confession when Miss Marple had caught the faintest glint of triumph in her eyes. It was subtle, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple had seen enough to know there was always one thread left unpulled. And then she remembered the photo, the one torn from the church archives. Bellamy had burned part of it, yes, but not the one in her possession. Miss Marple had studied it. Henri, Claire, Deschamps, and, just visible behind them, a young girl, a child, no older than 5, standing near the edge of the frame, overlooked, always overlooked. Miss Marple sat down slowly, heart beating just a little faster. Deschamps had no children. Henri had no known daughter. Claire had never mentioned a child, unless the child had been hidden, protected, or silenced. She drew her notebook again, flipping to a page near the beginning, an odd note Bellamy had made, offhand. You always see them again, don't you? Ghosts in the flesh, like mothers and daughters with the same eyes. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The case, it seemed, was not quite over after all. Justice had been served, or perhaps merely delayed, because ghosts didn't always haunt the past. Sometimes they walked in plain sight, waiting, watching, and biding their time. The morning of Miss Marple's departure arrived beneath a silver sky. Clouds drifted like old thoughts over the valley, casting long, dappled shadows over the vineyard and the winding lanes of Saint-Antoine-le-Haut. The village, still half asleep, seemed to hold its breath one final time, as if reluctant to let go of the woman who had unraveled its darkest secrets. At the train station, the platform was empty but for the inspector and Father Renaud, both standing quietly with Miss Marple as the distant whistle of the incoming train echoed across the hills. Her small suitcase rested neatly by her feet, and her gloves, spotless and pressed, were folded in her hands. I don't know what we would have done without you, Delacour said, not for the first time. It still feels as if you saw something none of us ever could. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile, eyes twinkling beneath the brim of her hat. It's not what one sees, Inspector. It's what one notices, and more importantly, what one remembers. Father Renaud offered her a paper-wrapped bundle, bread and soft cheese for the journey. From Madame Vallon, he said. She insisted. Miss Marple accepted it with a gracious nod. I shall eat it before Lion. That part of the journey always makes me peckish. Delacour cleared his throat. You're certain this is the end of it, then? That there's nothing more to uncover? Miss Marple's eyes wandered toward the hills, distant and pale in the morning mist. No, she said softly. I'm not certain at all. The train groaned into the station with a hiss of steam and steel. She stood, collected her bag, and turned once more toward the 2 men. There is something, she added, a small thing, probably nothing, but such things often are. Delacour tilted his head. What kind of thing? She hesitated, stepping closer. When I examined Claire's letters, I noticed something odd. Only once in all her careful handwriting, she switched languages. A phrase in Latin scribbled in the margin of a page, otherwise dedicated to her sister's wedding. At first, I assumed it was a priest's quote or some poetic flair, but it stayed with me." Delacour frowned. "What did it say?" Miss Marple looked him square in the eye. "Fiat voluntas eius, sed voluntas cui," she translated. "Let his will be done." "But whose will?" Father Renaud blinked. "That's not a typical biblical expression." "No, it isn't," Miss Marple agreed. And the ink was newer than the rest of the letter, as if added later, deliberately. Delacour shifted. "A message? Or a warning?" Miss Marple said. "I don't believe Claire wrote it for herself. I believe she copied it. It was a phrase she had heard before, perhaps whispered, perhaps chanted." Father Renaud looked uneasy. "A liturgical code, then?" "Or something more secretive," she said gently. "There are layers in this village still unpeeled, and secrets, I think, that belonged not to the widows, but to the men they left behind." Delacour looked skeptical. "But they're all gone." Miss Marple raised one eyebrow. "Are they?" "Henri was missing for 20 years, and even then we only found some of his remains. Claire returned with nothing but ashes and stories. Who's to say what else returned with her?" The train let out a hiss. The conductor waved. Miss Marple offered them a smile that felt too wise, too knowing to be truly comforting. "In any case," she said, "if you find yourself reading parish records and come across that phrase again, do let me know." Delacour opened his mouth to reply, but she had already turned and boarded the train, suitcase in one hand, her notebook tucked securely beneath her arm. Through the window, she gave a small wave. The train lurched forward, slow at first, then steady as it pulled away from the platform and disappeared into the hills. Delacour and Father Renaud stood in silence for a moment longer. The inspector finally spoke. "You don't think it's over?" he said. Renaud, watching the clouds roll in again, shook his head. "In a village this old, Inspector, nothing is ever over, only buried." Back in the rectory, after they had parted, Father Renaud opened the church's ledger to the year 1949 on a quiet suspicion. The pages were yellowed, edges curling like dried leaves. He scanned the entries until something stopped him. A baptism scrawled faintly, a name unfamiliar, and then next to it, a note in Latin in a different hand entirely. "Fiat voluntas eius, sed voluntas qui?" He stared at it, heartbeat quickening. No priest had signed the entry. The page trembled in his hand. And far away, in her train compartment, Miss Marple sipped her tea and looked out at the passing countryside. The mystery was solved, yes, but not ended. Mysteries, like memories, had a way of lingering, curling into corners, growing quiet roots, and she, more than anyone, knew how they always found their way back into the light.